Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fourth episode of the BetTALker podcast. Today we have Ciaran with us, and of course, our founder, Duncan Garby. Uh, Ciaran,
Just clarifying, that's founder, not funder. I don't have the money to do all of this.
yeah, well, you didn't buy some crypto 15 years ago. I thought
I
that
certainly
that
did
was.
not.
Oh, shit. Yeah. So, Ciaran, can you tell us a little bit about your background? How did you end up here?
Well, thanks very much, lads, for having me on. I've been meaning to do this for a while, and it's always good to be on a show with people I have the utmost respect for. Um, I started in the sector in December 2009. I still remember my very first day. I initially worked in video game retail and then got the opportunity when I was made redundant, got the opportunity to come on work for Full Tilt Poker as a night shift agent in December 2009. So that was my first introductory, just in customer service.
Okay.
Right.
What did you learn there about, safer gambling and all
Nothing.
this
I'm
stuff?
going to I just got to clarify that right now. Nothing. When I started, the reason I got the job in Full Tilt as a night shift agent was I had a poker background. I'd grown up playing poker.
Right.
In an age, I'm older than I look, but in an age before we had constant online gaming and the likes. So I was taught playing poker and playing card games as a kid, just matchsticks, playing for literally bags of crisps.
Yeah.
And that seemingly was one of the traits and one of the skills I had. That was the reason I got the job. But when I started as a night shift agent, occasionally you get orgy cases, it was called back then, and they get put into this queue when they come in, and you'd ever ask about them, what goes there? The answer was, don't you mind. Don't worry about that. Just leave that. Someone else on the day shift or someone else will take care of it. It was probably a good 9-10 months before I started having a chance at those cases. And what happened at the time was it became very clear nobody in the operations department either had any training, there was no procedures, they had no training, and no one actually wanted to handle these cases because, as we all know well, they're pretty harrowing cases in some instances. There's not if customer does A, you do B. If customer does B, you do C. There's no procedure, especially back then. This is 2009, 2010. There isn't the landscape there is now. So what I found, and to answer your question properly, my introduction to those cases was I was assigned one day and told, just fix them. Just solve them however you can. Just get them solved. And so there's a procedure or training. No, just read it, come up with an answer. Now, that would deter a lot of people and go, no thanks. That actually, to me, made my eyes light up. That these were really engaging, interesting cases.
What were you doing back then? Because I suppose that you need to learn on the job.
It was general support, so general customer engagement. Player emails in about a deposit issue, player emails in about a hand issue, player emails in about a technical problem with the game client or something they ordered from the store. General customer service.
Yeah.
But occasionally you would get cases from players who would have had, can you please disable this game format for me? I don't like playing cash games, or I need a set deposit limit. I want to test my gameplay, or, worst case scenario, I think I'm developing a problem, or I have a full-blown issue. Please block my account. There was no procedure. There was no framework really for safer gambling back then, or responsible gaming. So when these cases would come in, the nice way of saying it is they would be considered for a while and sat on. But in reality, a lot of times they just sat in the queues. People had their accounts somewhat disabled, and then they were never answered because simply nobody, it wasn't an area that anyone was trained in, really.
It's not just not an area anybody's trained in. these cases, I mean, coming from the background of the POG and dispute management, and much like yourself, actually, I mean, I started managing disputes in 2011, and there were no regulatory systems to speak of. The regulators were ignoring complaints. Doesn't matter what the complaints were about; they were just being ignored. Um, and that's kind of bled through over the years on sort of the gambling harm related cases. They are the absolute nightmare to deal with because there's quite often no happy ending to be reached. And because of that, nobody wants to engage with them. I much like yourself, I ended up kind of making up the rules as I went for a number of years before the regulators started to catch up and introduce systems of what their expectations were and how complaints would be managed. So yeah, I can fully understand that just via natural human behavior early on, none of these operators internally, nobody wanted to touch the RG complaints. That's just setting yourself up for misery.
Yeah, and that's it. And as you'll know, if anyone who's ever worked in a large scale operation, especially customer facing large scale operation, these companies live and die by procedures. They want everybody following the same procedure. Deviation or going off the script tends to be penalized. If you need an example, ring up your insurance company tomorrow and ask them to give you a special one-off rate. The CSR, the underwriter fund, can't do that. They're not trained. It's not taken into consideration. I was lucky, I suppose you'd say that my manager at the time, when I was working night shift and then moved on to day, saw something in me, an aptitude and interest, and said, try it. Just see what you can do. See if you can email the player. See if you can give them a one-off answer. And it's something I found I had a natural interest in, and dare I say, affinity for it. And from then, they became my cases. Like that became one of my main responsibilities. So this is still mid 2010, 2011. I worked your GQ. That's it. They were my cases. So if I wasn't there that day, probably weren't dealt with. Not guaranteeing it, but it became my primary.
But this is the evolution that the sector has been on in the last 15 years. That's the truth. It might be uncomfortable to acknowledge that was the way it was back then, but it doesn't change that that's the way it was, and we should acknowledge it. So, how did your role evolve from that point?
Well, without spoiling for anyone who doesn't know the story, Fulton Poker lost their license. Shock horror. Go look up the story. Get a nice dinner and a few beers. You'll laugh your heart out. And while we at Fulton Poker, while there was no operations license, so literally no business going on, I was tapped by management to put on, along with actually another person called Ciaran, we were tapped by management to onboard and upskill the staff in poker, because it was noticed as a huge gap that the actual staff, customer service staff, they knew customer service, so they knew how to engage with customers and how to stick to the policies, but most of them hadn't a clue about the product they were supporting. They didn't know poker at all. So if there's a poker query, it was use a template or send it to poker specialists. So I was asked, along with the other Ciaran, to put on poker training. So we did that. And at the same time, that went really well. At the same time, another manager went, well, would you be interested in putting on responsible gaming training? At this point, I'm probably doing the RG cases for 4 or 5 months. Like I said, it became pretty much my primary duty for most of the time I was there, that and poker cases. So from then, I started put together a deck, put together training material based on my understanding, the little bit of regulations there was available, and sort of policies and templates and sort of training material I'd hobbled together through trial and error over the last couple of months. Put that together, rolled that out to the rest of my colleagues, and it was surprisingly well received. These projects take us up to about 2012, middle of the year 2012. just before the merger between Stars and Full Tilt. So when they merged and relaunched, I was soon contacted by the head of the well-established and well-respected PokerStars Sensible Safer Gambling team, Jeannie David, and she said, "We need someone in Dublin, and everybody says you're the guy. So do you want the job?" And from then on in,
it's really interesting because I met her, years ago when I was working for gambling therapy. She was a lovely lady. Yeah, yeah. Uh, I I wanted to ask you because you said that you play poker from a young age. And in my experience, particularly when you work with safer gambling people, many of them, they're sort of attracted, to these sort of roles, because sometimes they have a loved one or someone important to them, that they have suffered from or struggle with any type of addictive uh,
Yeah.
problems or addictive disorder. Do you have? I mean, you don't have to speak about it if you don't want to. Do you have
no,
any sort of experience of anyone close to you that has struggled with gambling or something else?
no. Mine, the same question was what I used to put when I would train or when I would train new people to join a PokerStars team. I would ask them, what has brought you into this position? Like, what has attracted you to this role? Again, I'd never asked them to my details, but the predominant trait was I have a family member or it's some experience. In my case, no. What appealed to me about the cases was they were unique. There was no procedure. There were no policies. It required a very outside the box thinking, and in some way you were given a lot of autonomy outside normal customer engagement rules to handle these. It's just something, Pedro, that I found I had a natural talent for, and it was recognized and appreciated by my colleagues. They all said, "You're really good at this. Would you continue to do it?" So I couldn't tell you that it was destined for me or that it was I had some lifelong trajectory into it. It just sort of happened, but it's where I spent my entire adult life to this point. Do what you're good at was the expression, and I was good at that.
I can associate with that. I mean, BetBlocker doesn't come from some personal trauma. It doesn't come from a close loved one damage or harm or anything like that. It's come from managing complaints and managing disputes and coming into contact with people who needed help day in and day out, and that help not really being there. And that was enough to push me to try and do more on that front. So yeah, it can be a little bit of an unusual journey into this space, and sometimes it can leave, certainly it can leave me feeling a little bit othered, because so many of the people in this space are coming from lived experience backgrounds, and you can suffer a bit of imposter syndrome, I guess, because you're not coming from that space. But I think it's valid, and I like to see people who are getting into this place without necessarily having taken that road through that trauma.
I mean, I suppose that you have some vicarious experience. Okay, you have dealt with a lot of players that they're suffering harm,
Mm-hmm.
and you say, okay, like someone needs to help them.
Yeah, it was. It was. You do. I don't know the nice way to say it. You do sort of have to dissociate from them. Like if you do, say,
Yeah.
for gambling cases, we all know from this area, you do have to sort of grow a thick shell and dissociate from what you're reading, from the harm you may or may not be dealing with, the misinformation or the grey area some people have. But in this case, like I would have taken on a lot at least early days when I started doing these cases, they would have bothered me quite a bit. Mainly, as you said, because there was no procedures, there was no one to talk to, and in a lot of cases, people were coming out as you were their last hope. Like, this is a time before the recognition of lived experience. This is before we had gambling helplines. For the most part, this is before there was dedicated national health resources to gambling addiction. Before it was a well-known and not received, but well appreciated syndrome. So there was those cases sort of did get in on me for a while. Like I said, I spent 10 years doing it, hundreds and hundreds of cases a week. So at some point along the road, I just sort of dissociated from and appreciate that this was the job I'd chosen. This was the area I'd chosen. And you want to help people, but for me, I wanted to make sure I was doing this right. Didn't always make sure didn't guarantee I was going to make anyone's friends, and I may not have made their life, measurably better. But I knew I was doing the right thing. Not always the good thing, but the right thing. And that's what I took solace from for years.
How do you know what's the right thing?
Well, you have to sort of take side back. Maybe this is a little bit. The right thing is to stop the harm then and there, and to signpost people to the best services they can to try and address them. They may want to win the money back, but you have to sometimes take the position of not to serve what's right and wrong for the people, but the right thing would have been a decision that is in the player's best interest and in the company's best interest. So you had to sort of walk that line, and that's what I always would have said to people when I was training them. It's a very unique role in that you have to keep two concerns in your head simultaneously. What's in the best interest of the players and what's in the best interest of the business. And you have to walk that line with all decisions. So the right thing would have been to stop the harm and to signpost people as best you can to get services, to get help, to educate themselves, and hopefully try to mitigate against future incidents or future problems.
So back then, for example, I assume that there would be like Gamblers Anonymous before the helplines and all of this, or
yeah, the Gamblers Anonymous existed and gambling therapy, but that was predominantly it. There wasn't a whole lot of regional and domestic services for a lot of people. I remember actually when I was in the PokerStars team, a initiative we spent 3-4 months doing, ringing up different state bodies, ringing up different organizations in countries, trying to get a list together of, say, support bodies in Mozambique, support bodies in Estonia, support bodies in Andorra. In a lot of cases, they didn't exist. Even though you'd have customers from there and problems, that didn't exist.
They still not exist in many places. You know, so it's tough. It's tough. Yeah.
We were just speaking with Gabriel from Gamble Aware Nigeria last week, and yeah, some of the information he's giving on what's going on in Nigeria right now is utterly shocking, frankly. And the lack of support, and even just, I mean, one of his big issues is that the third sector in the Western world won't even talk to them. They're not asking for financial support. They're asking for mentorship. They're asking for people in groups to try and help them learn how to do better. And they're struggling to just get that conversation going. And that's something I think we all need to pick up.
It's a global environment. Gambling is worldwide. It doesn't stop at any particular region, and even if it's not legal, there's a black market there. So gambling is global. So education on gambling and services for gambling and gambling harm needs to be global. It can't be a case of it stops at a border.
It's, the way I always say it is, gambling addiction is no different in India or South Africa or Argentina than it is in the UK. So I don't see why I would want to limit anybody from accessing BetTALker in these places that probably need the support even more.
And I think there's a bit of a historical depth, because for example, like even operators that they have withdrew from unregulated markets in the past, you know the main operators, they were operating everywhere, and it's a bit like, okay, you complain now, but a few years ago you were the black market for those, I
Yeah.
think it's important to say, look, even if we no longer operate that, or it's always important to help people that they don't have anywhere else to go.
Well, it's human
And I,
nature. Sorry, Duncan. It's human nature, and ultimately, if you want to talk about economics or you want to take a slightly different, public outcry and public want will always see somebody come in to fill the void. If you ban cigarettes, like black market cigarettes will come on. If you ban like TikTok, well, then someone's going to fill that void. As long as there's a public demand for it, there'll always be somebody there to meet that demand. What are you going to say, Duncan, sir?
well, yeah, that's basically what I was going to say, is that with this industry, no matter how we manage it, with this industry comes the black market. And it's not good enough for the regulated market to say, well, we're managing gambling harm for the regulated market. That's not good enough. It needs to be for all of it. It comes as a package, and we know that the black market is going to not just ignore gambling harms, they're going to exploit gambling harms. Well, we have to try and offset that. We have to step up to the plate and do everything that we can to counter the damage that the black market is doing. And that's what a responsible sector looks like. And it's a hard thing to hear, and it's a hard message to sell. But that's what we need to try.
Yeah, absolutely. If people want analogies, think about it like the main brewers or the main alcohol producers. It would be the same position saying, well, customers didn't get addicted. They're not addicted to our beer or our products, so we're not going to be interested in helping them or looking people at alcohol poisoning. It doesn't matter necessarily where the harm was started or who's the company that provided it. All services and all regulators sort of have to take into account the entire picture, not just their slice of it.
And I think we are getting there. We are making progress, and I know it's very easy to get down on the general politics of the sector, but we are making progress, and it is getting better slowly. One of the major areas, and this again steps back to what I was saying just a moment ago about Nigeria, is what we kind of need to start working together more. No, this sounds revolutionary, but regulators around the world, jurisdictions need to start cooperating more, because the internet shows no borders. It respects no borders. So when a regulator says, well, we're the regulator for this country and we're going to behave as if nothing outside this country exists, they're baking it. They're not fighting with the same weaponry as the other side. Regulators need to start working together. Charities need to start working together. We need to take a more global approach to the whole problem. And it's really frustrating to watch all this, but we are getting better.
Ciaran, I wanted to ask you, because you said that after a while, you sort of had to dissociate a little bit, like build a shell. What are the sort of cases that have stayed with you? Do you?
I remember the names of most of the people who ever like really, really hard cases. I remember their names. I remember what they looked like. I probably will to the day I go on the ground. There's one case I'll happily talk about, and I'll talk about this to everybody. It's one I used to use as an actual training example, and it's to do with what I would consider the absolute worst case scenario in a gambling issue, which was a self-harm and suicide threat. And this happened before I was ever in safer gambling. It was my sixth day, I think, fifth or sixth shift working on when I first started full-time poker. So this is 2009, a few days before Christmas. And this young man, we'll call him Brad, even though that wasn't his name. He rings up, and he was calling from the middle of nowhere, Arkansas. And he rang up and he said that he had a gun in his hand and he was going to do the worst thing imaginable. And it's always stayed with me. I remember the conversation. The conversation was over an hour. Now, I'd had no training whatsoever, and anyone listening to this, I plead with you, never try to handle a self-harm case if you're not trained on it. It's one of the most dangerous things you can do. But I just listened to the guy, and he explained to me that him and his girlfriend had just got married. The guy was 21. He was a couple of weeks younger than I was at the time. Him and his girlfriend had just gotten engaged. They were going to get married. They'd saved together a little bit of money, and they were going to have a fairly low-key wedding. So he had come up with the idea, or someone had floated the idea with him, that if he took that money, deposited it, and then won or more, he could give his bride-to-be the day of her dreams. A very, very noble and a very understandable intention. I want to give my wife, and those of you who are married or are getting married, you want to make your bride or the person you're married, you want to give them everything they can that day. So I understood where he's coming from. I'm married since, I know what it's like. But he lost it all, and his intended in-laws had given him a bit of money, his boss had given him a bit of money, and they'd saved. So they had this small pot together that had come from a couple of different sources, and he'd lost it all, and he didn't know what he was going to do. I didn't know how he was going to face her or explain it to his friends. Now, I pinged my manager at the time saying, help, what the hell, what do I do? And I was told, get him off the phone. I don't know, just Christ, I don't know what to do. I said, well, what do I tell this guy? I said, we don't know. We don't do stuff like this. So what happened was I just had to listen. Like I said, this guy is clearly in trouble. I don't know his background, but I'm not going to hang up the phone on someone who's probably I was the last person in the world who's actually going to listen to him. So I just listened. Like I didn't know what to say. I had no training. I couldn't give him any answers. So I just listened and listened and listened. And eventually when he was done, he said, right, she's pulling in the door now. Thanks very much, Finn, for listening to me, because I never use my real name. Thanks very much for listening to me. You've no idea. And I thought nothing about it. Like I said, the call finished up. I just said to my boss, I'm going for the longest smoke break I think anyone's ever taken. I went outside and came back in and just went on about my shift. And a few days later, the guy rang back in, and I'd heard from another colleague that he wanted to thank me for taking the time listening to him. He had spoken to his girlfriend. He'd agreed to go and get, and that maybe he recognised that they were rushing into the marriage too soon. So maybe what he'd done was like a misguided or a manifestation of other issues. That happened in 2009. And I still remember the call, I still remember his voice, everything about it. I've trained anyone I've ever trained about suicide or anyone I've ever raised to, I would always refer to that case. Not to scare them or to upset them, but to remind them that that was the worst case scenario where you had to take a call like that nobody was trained to handle and no one was going to help. As long as I was in stars, there would always have been someone who could help you, someone who could escalate the call to, or someone who could give you a helping hand. So long-winded way, Pedro was saying, that's probably the one of them that I'll never forget. There are others, but I think that enough people have heard that story by now that it's pretty much okay to share it.
It's really interesting because you did, in an intuitive way, what this one of the best practice. Just ask the person, okay, please tell me what's going on.
Mhm.
And let the person to talk about the problem. Because in many occasions, the person get the you know weight of his chest. Can sort of get his train of thought.
Mhm.
Listen to themselves. And calm themselves down. So it's really interesting because you were saying that, be like you had it on you. And you did. Sort of what is best practice in a intuitive way without getting in the training. Which I think is
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's quite cool. The problem
Listening.
yeah, the
Mhm.
problem sometimes is that you get you know people that they're not trained, and they're not may not have that sort of intuition, and they try to provide a solution, or they try to do something that, and sometimes, if you don't let the person, you know get the things of their system, you sort of not helping, even if you mean well. Yeah, so it's
Yeah.
quite good.
Because it's, I said, it stayed with me, and I've gone on to train probably. I don't know how many people I've given suicide interaction training to now, because I went on and I got certified to do it, and I did it for PokerStars for dog's years. Um, but I've probably trained like well over 2,000 people in safer gambling over the years.
Hmm.
And the bit I would always tell people, one of the things, even if they weren't becoming a specialist, even if just general onboarding for staff, is you're reading words on a page, whether it's sincere or otherwise, you just treat it as sincere, but understand that it's not being directed to you. Like the other side of the safer gambling, which I think it never gets covered, is the level of abuse that staff hit. Like some of the cruelest things words ever committed to word processor have probably been said to me. They'd scare the color out of your skin literally to read them. But that was one of the other parts where you have to dissociate from it.
you know
And in the age of abuse and the age of so much awareness for the people's social media abuse and stuff like that, you have no idea what the people in the companies actually have to deal with.
it's really interesting, that you mentioned that, because I remember when I was, head of operations on my first gambling job. I was horrified with the things, that sometimes customers were telling to my staff. And I was, look, uh, before I came there, it was like, okay, you just take it. The paying customers.
Mm.
When I joined, it's okay, you have like a three-strike rule, and then the ban from the phone. But and I remember having a person on my team. I said, oh, how, and she said, oh, it's fine, because I used to work in a shop before, you know, and then it was another level. Once there was a guy with a hammer that wanted to get me. Another time I had somebody throwing a chair over. One person throw me excrements. It's like, look, I'm, you know,
Oh,
I'm,
What type of
compare.
shop was this person working in?
I will mention but I remember her. Her name. And I was like, look, this is nothing compared what I have done, gone through, going through retail.
I,
The other thing that that you mentioned about the suicide training,
mm,
I remember, and this is 2016
mm,
when I started, trying to deliver training, and again, there was really a pushback. Okay, we don't even want to get this type of training. So it's really great that you started doing this, back in the day.
well, that's one
I,
thing I can say. Sorry, Douglas, I just said me and Pedro talk about. I'm happy to say that at least in my experience, people were receptive. I know that's not always I know that's not most people's mileage, but where I worked, at least staff and ownership and all were receptive to it. Sorry, Duncan, I didn't mean to cut across you.
No, I was going to go off in a different direction anyway. Just about abuse and complaints. This is something I deal with on a regular basis, both targeted at operators and targeted at me. um, it's. I'm sure many people listening will who have dealt with a sort of customer facing role within the sector will be able to understand this. But it is absolutely astounding to me what people think that they can get away with saying just because it's online. That degree of I'm behind the screen, I can say what I want. I have had to. I mean, I've had to tell complainants very directly. I've read your chat transcripts with the operator. The way you have behaved is entirely unacceptable. If anything like this happens again while we are managing this complaint, that will be the end of this process. Understand that when you behave like that, you have just empowered the gambling operator with a new reason not to manage your dispute. It no longer matters whether you actually had a legitimate issue. If you are being abusive to them, they no longer need to deal with you. And
Rightly so.
and you have some players who respond to that by saying, yes, I understand. I was angry and I shouldn't have said the things I said. And please help me. It won't happen again. And you have others, and I've had one case within the last 6 months who turned around and said, I have the right to speak to them however I want, and I won't be told by you. And at which point we say, goodbye. We're not helping you then. Bye. We are not putting ourselves in a situation where we're going to further the abuse that you send to an operator. Just not doing it.
Yeah, it is staggering why people are surprised by the abuse they get done. Like if there's a public outcry because some personality gets a mean tweet or something like that, why don't you just plug into a phone that the people in your car insurance or the people who deliver your Sky have to deal with every day? Go listen to what the guy in the petrol station is told day in, day out. That'll really see abuse. A guy look at it now, and again back to an early point, I grew with thick skin. Some of the worst things I've ever seen were directed towards me. But I appreciated the fact that if this person was to meet me in public, they wouldn't say that to me. They wouldn't nowhere near have the neck to utter it. Well, most of them wouldn't have had the neck to do it.
Yeah.
But I just appreciated it. It wasn't, you didn't have to accept it, but I knew it came with the territory of the job.
Yeah.
And I, again, empowered by my managers, that I could pull them up on it. I could actually turn the tables and say, if you're going to call me these many different words, well, here's what you said to me, and here's what I'm going to say to you in return. Normal customer service agents can't do that in any business. They have to just, I'm going to warn you once, I'm going to warn you twice. And it does. It gets in on them. Like that sort of stuff being said to you day in, day out would really affect you. I was lucky in that I was allowed to turn around and go, hang on here a second now. You want to be very careful what you utter to me. Because ultimately, and this is the thing, maybe I'm letting the cat out of the bag here, but if you're going to send abuse, just bear in mind one thing. The companies have your address. They have your name. They have your ID documents. They have your payment processors. We know who you are. There's no anonymity. Just get that out of your head immediately. We know who you are, and your information will be handed over to the authorities if you cross a line. And I've done it.
I've had to do it. Especially when it gets to the point of the dual reasons. One is if it gets to personally threatening.
Yeah, gotcha.
At which point you have to hand that information on to the police, even though you know the police are going to do nothing with it. You need that report logged to ensure that if something does happen, the police know who to look for. And the other one is when somebody threatens to hurt themselves. At that point, you need to pass that information along and further some sort of check, some sort of intervention. So yes, there's no anonymity. You don't get to engage in the regulated markets. You don't get to engage without everybody knowing who you are, and I would never consider. I'm not saying I've never written an angry email in my life. I've written plenty of angry emails in my life. But there's a line between expressing I am unhappy about this and I expect you to fix it, and I am going to spew hate-filled abuse at you. And there's a large section of the population that seem to feel entitled to abuse.
Yeah, I've always said I am probably an absolute horror to deal with from a customer service point of view, because I legitimately know what you can and can't do when you work in those jobs.
Yeah.
Sorry, there's no supervisor. Bullshit. Yes, there's a supervisor on staff. There's no way you'd be allowed one. But I've never sworn at a CSR. Very simply, I'm a horror to deal with, and I probably, throw word soup at them. But I would never swear at them, because ultimately you're just doing a job. Like the way I always talk about it is horse blinkers. People in those jobs, especially the immediate customer facing, they're only shown like this much. They cannot deviate from the script or procedure. They'll lose their jobs. So if you have a complaint, you immediately speak to a manager. And the line I always use, and my friends and family hate it, but sorry, CSR, you're not paid or empowered at a level to deal with the amount of trouble I'm going to cause. So please put me through to your manager and save us both a headache.
I do remember, much like yourself, I'm probably an absolute nightmare to deal with as a customer. And I do remember one particular agent saying that they were going to disconnect me because I was threatening to shout at them. And I just turned around and said, what does that mean? Threatening to shout at you. I have not raised my voice. I have simply been very firm in telling you what I will and will not accept. That was a surreal day.
Everybody that is watching this podcast now is canceling your subscription. You're going to get a lot of email like ASOS no longer wants you as a customer. Amazon Prime.
Oh well.
There's plenty of competition out there.
Yeah,
there is. So, Ciaran, right, that took you up to what, around about 2016, was it?
No, I finished working when I joined the Safer Gambling team, the DK7 Gambling team was 2013. That was the only job I did till I left PokerStars in December 22. That's the only area I ever worked in. And then I left, then I went to go work for another operator for a couple of months. And that finished up in May 23. And then, as you know, I took 6 months out and just decided that I had my fill of dealing with working in operators for a while. So I said that I'd go out separately, set up my consultancy. But like I said, I'll tell you, my entire adult life has been spent working pretty much in safer gambling. Yeah. So it's 2013 to 2023. That is the only thing, the only subject, the only department I ever worked in.
Do you have any regrets about that?
No.
Or no? You're happy with that?
None whatsoever. I'm happy with the type of work I chose. This is probably not going to be particularly pleasant for some people, depending on their own mileage, but that work gave me everything I have. Like, it's how I afforded my home. It's how it's given me the life I have. Do I think it was, like, looking back now, if I knew now what I knew back then, I'd still have chosen this life. It was hard.
That's good.
Yeah, I like I said, I'd like to think I have helped more people and educated more people, than I've harmed. I'm pretty sure I won't get any Christmas cards from ex-customers, but I have met ex-customers since. Once they, because I said I never use my real name, the Batman effect. If you know what it is, you'll know why I didn't. But when I explained who I was, I get thank yous. I get, yeah, I know I may have been a horror to you, but thank you. And I've had messages from people over the years who said, "You've saved my marriage. If it hadn't been for your intervention, me and my wife would have split up. You're the reason I could still have a relationship with my dad. You put me straight early on, helped me, get together, and now me and my wife are still together, me and my housemate." One guy told me that if it wasn't for him, if it wasn't for the emails I'd sent him, be very clear, his business would have folded. So that stuff's stayed with me. But no, I'm happy I did the job I did for as long as I did.
Who have been your main influences, from safer gambling?
Jeannie David. I owe so much of what I have to Jeannie. I got it here by myself. Like, I didn't get any favors. I earned it. But definitely my main influence and the main person I took any insight from the train was from Jeannie.
What did you learn from her?
She was my direct manager when I started in PokerStars. So Jeannie is probably one of the pioneers of safer gambling, responsible gaming, whatever you want to call it. She started back in 2006, and she took her years of being an addiction counselor before she got into poker. So she taught me how to deal with players. She educated me on the certain behaviors, the certain triggers that would exist for gambling addicts. Because before I started dealing with these cases, I had no experience in any sort of addiction. I went from working in games and being a poker player to, by hook and by crook, becoming the point of contact for full-time poker, and then got the opportunity in PokerStars. But I never had any formal training. No one had ever sat me down and educated me on it.
It's
Jeannie
interesting
did.
because I knew that Jeannie, she was a poker player, but I didn't knew that she was an addiction counselor.
Yeah, yeah. Her life existed in addiction before it got into poker.
Okay, that's really cool.
But she's probably my main influence, and then the guy who was my mentor after that, Jeffrey. Those two are the two main people, because they invested the time.
I know Jeffrey.
Yeah,
Australian, no?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm fairly sure, like, there's been a few people now, as narcissistic as it sounds, who will quote me as being their influence or their mentor.
Well, that's
because
good.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, they invested the time into me, so I'm a huge advocate for pay it forward. They had the time and the resources to give me, so I was a mentor and a trainer for like 40 different specialists, and I made sure every single one of them got my time and got a proper level of training and got patience, because safer gambling's a job. You can't just do it. Right, here's 2 days orientation, off you go. You can't do it properly that way. I would say it take like a year to fully train a safer gambling specialist to a point where I'd be comfortable letting them take over or letting them run by themselves. Because you can't anticipate the type of work this is, what you're going to read, what you're going to be subjected to. So you need to.
It's very triggering.
Yeah. It's also complicated. Like, I would always say that a proper safer gambling specialist probably needs to be a product expert. They need to know gambling. They need to know human behavior. I came from a position of being a poker player. I know what poker players went through. I was a gamer. I knew there's a lot of crossover. And then I had people developers and product managers who sat down and explained how the game client worked and all the minutiae. A lot of safer gambling specialists don't get that. They don't get that level of access or that level of education. So I would always, when I was training new specialists, make sure they understood the game client, they understood the mechanics behind the curtains, because it means they can give a better level of service and solution to the customers. And ideally, if you solve the problem early or get engagement with people early, they don't come back. And that is a result for safer gambling. You don't want to see repeat customers.
I find it actually astounding across the sector how thin the knowledge of the product actually is. There are cultures within organisations that don't emphasise actually, and it's a challenge. I mean, the last thing we want is gambling operators going and encouraging their staff to gamble. That there are ethical concerns around doing that, but at the same time, they need to have a working understanding of the mechanics of gambling if they're going to, in all aspects, if they're going to protect customers, if they're going to run user support, if they're going to sell it, no matter what role they occupy. If it's customer facing, they need to understand the mechanics of gambling. I find so few people in the sector do.
I mean, you know, 100%. You need to have a basic understanding of gambling products. At least you cannot just read the knowledge management database and say step one do this,
No.
step one do that. Something that it was really really interesting that you say is a lot of this sort of experts in 4 hours. There's a lot of people that they do a training 4 hours and oh yeah, I'm an expert. You mentioned, look, before I take the support wheels, the bike of my staff, it's a long process.
Well, it is. It's like they're. You've seen my posts, you've seen my position, you both know how I stand it. I think safer gambling are specialists. They are specialists. They're not normal customer service, they're not customer engagement. They have to, and I'm using myself as the yardstick here. But you have to understand product, you have to understand fraud, you have to understand AML, you have to understand human behavior, human psychology, even if it's penny psychology. You need to understand. You need to understand the game. You need to understand customer engagement, like how to engage with customers, what's okay. I'm lucky as well in that I worked for VIP before I got into safer gambling. So I understand that level of business as well. Compliance. Like you do need to have a huge array to be really effective at this. I'm lucky in that I was in the office I worked in. I was the only person. I was one man on an island, as I always used to joke. And I had access to everybody and people at the time. So if I wanted to know what Treasury got up to, I could go, I want to have a sit-down meeting with you, and everyone was forthcoming. I know that's not the case for a lot of people, and I know that from going on to work for other companies, that's definitely not the expected behavior. Mine was an exception. But if you want to do the job well, I feel you have to do that. You can't just rely on templates and you can't just rely on risk models. You have to have a better understanding.
I didn't know that you work in VIP before, but one of my mantras, I say, look, the VIP skills, they're so transferable for safer gambling, and I had people when I work in different companies from VIP coming to me and say, oh, I would love to work in your team, but the problem is that the salary step down is significant. I mean, sometimes you need to take some compromise. Probably you'll be paid more in your role as a VIP manager, or than working with people that they're vulnerable, that require those skills plus some extra ones.
I hate to say this, but that is such backwards thinking. I'm not saying what you're saying is backwards, Pedro. I'm saying the very practice of paying your VIP agents more than your safer gambling agents is backwards, because I understand it from the commercial perspective. These people are bringing in the money. They're the ones that are doing the sales front. But who's likely to end you up with the fines? You don't manage the safer gambling interactions right, it's the fines that are going to clobber you. your safer gambling team are just as important commercially as your VIP team.
Duncan, that's you know, because for many years, the fines they were very small. The
Yeah.
reality and the risk of a big operator to get the license
Well,
was very small. So the reality is, you know, that until now,
tho-
the case benefit, you know,
yeah.
but
Oh
I
no, I,
had,
I, I totally agree. But those days are gone now,
yeah,
and
no,
we might
definitely.
there might be people in the sector that wish they weren't, but those days are gone, and the slow and steady march of regulation is only going to see things get tighter and tighter across every single market.
I mean, kudos to you, Kieran, for you know moving on the direction. Maybe even if the wallet was not in the you know.
Um, I didn't like working in VIP. That's part of it. I didn't actually like that. Yes, sir. No, sir. 3 bags full, sir. No, thanks. I
Yeah,
didn't like that. I have respect for people in VIP, but I couldn't care less. It doesn't matter if you put in 100 grand or 100 quid.
yeah.
You're still squishy and you're so bony on the inside. I couldn't care less. I didn't bow to anybody. Um, but I would wholeheartedly agree that safer gambling specialists should be better remunification than they get. If nothing else, and again, this is my mileage, the RG team are the people who have to put out the fires, not even just the fines. Like when a customer is irate and it has gone to hell, where do you think those cases landed? It was the black hole effect of everything gets sucked in, and the RG team had to fix it. So you got dealt with, forgive the puns, you got dealt a lot of really rough hands, and you had to fix it. Um, and the other side is the reason why to go all the way back earlier, Pedro, I said that I always try to do the right thing when dealing with cases. I'm one of the few people I know who's ever worked for a company that actually got their license pulled. So I know what that is like as well. I have that experience to lean back on, and it's horrible. It's a really, really, really awkward and unpleasant place to be. I remember giving a training session once, not too long ago, and I just start off by imagine having financial worries. You don't know what one day is going to come. Your bills coming at the door, mental health impacts, possible loss of family, and the person went, "Oh yeah, that's what definitely has been gambling." And I said, "No, that's what's like working with a company that's license is pulled."
Yeah.
Like think about what the staff go through with that. So I definitely would like to think that customers are operators are becoming more wary and treating the RG teams better, because the fact that in a lot of cases themselves and compliance are the only people that are keeping you from the regulator's grip.
And which role is an objective point of view, which role is more challenging?
Safer
VIP, where
gambling.
you're selling, or safer gambling, where you are having to defuse those angry conversations and manage the risky conversations. There's I mean, no disrespect to anybody who's a VIP agent out there. I appreciate the job that they have to do. I understand the talent that it takes, but you will encounter far fewer hostile situations and far fewer high pressure situations than you will if you're dealing with RG.
I mean, I have to say that I also have worked with VIP teams. That they were doing the
Mm-hmm.
safer gambling training. Sometimes the pressures, they come from above. So it's not that
Yeah,
you get very good people that they try to do a job, but sometimes their KPIs and SLAs may be
yeah,
a bit too high, and they got in a difficult place.
and
I'll
that's
refer to.
exactly, and they're facing that economic cliff
Hmm.
edge as well, because if they're not hitting those targets, they can be out the door. So I certainly don't want to diminish the pressure they're under.
I'll go back to my answer because I knew exactly what your question was going to be. Safer gambling. Safer gambling is the harder job by a mile. It's probably the hardest job in the entire industry because, as I said, you have to balance both the well-being of the customers and the well-being of the business. Plus, and I always like to try and signpost this, it's not just about dealing with gambling harm. Like there's a misrepresentation that that's all safer gambling do is deal with the
Yeah,
horror stories in the worst case. A lot of what I dealt with was game restrictions in to do handle like requirements and understand parts of the game which nearly no other business unit had to worry about. Like I had to keep in my head at all times 26 different license and regulations. So if ever the question came in, I knew the answer then. Who else has to do that? I had to understand how each and every part of the admin tool and corresponded with each and every bit of the game client. No other, no other customer facing department has to do that.
Yeah, it's nuts what you're saying because I remember this sort of thing that you have like the UK safer gambling team
Mm-hmm.
and the rest of the world safer gambling team, and sometimes it's okay you're dealing with one license and this other team is dealing with you know 8 or 12, and it's a bit madness what you can do this limits, different regulation product. So it's tough job.
But it took time. It took, and this was to go back, it took time to understand that. You
Yeah,
couldn't just
yeah,
do, here's a 2 hour onboarding course, off you go, break a leg. You couldn't do that. There's no way that would have run or operated. You needed time, you needed a slow approach.
I wanted to ask you because how is the landscape at the moment in Ireland with the regulator and all of that? Do you have any insights, thoughts?
I don't have a whole lot of insight. Me and Duncan have discussed this at that. Um, it's on the way. The regulator is on the way. They're currently backfilling roles. A lot of companies and operators have already sought licensing. Outside of that, I can't give you any massive more details. I haven't had a chance to meet the regulators. I've spoken to their different units, but I haven't actually met the people, the decision makers. But I'm
yeah,
close to people who would be closer, so I have like a third hand engagement with them.
Mm.
Um, I think, and this is where my series about where do you stand for the regulators comes from. I think, at least publicly, there's a huge misconception of what the regulators actually are and what they're
Mm-hmm.
actually going to do. That's a massive problem. I think that's a big, big issue that's going to come down the lines is that the public don't understand what the regulator is there for, what powers they have, what powers they don't have. The regulators are just starting up, so it's going to be about 18 months before they find their feet. And in the meantime, the operators are the people who are ahead of both groups. And they are just going to keep functioning the way they are right now. Because,
Mm.
spoiler alert for a lot of people, most of the operators are already ahead of what the regulations mean. You don't kind of look through the regulations with a fine tooth comb. I don't know of
yeah,
any operator that's actually going to have to raise to meet that level. They're all already above it.
yeah.
And wouldn't they benefit from someone with your experience? Because I think sometimes you see people moving from regulators to industry, but I haven't seen, or maybe in very few occasions I cannot that there's any osmosis the other way.
From your mouth to their ears, hopefully. Like I'm open for business. I'll start
Yeah,
handing out
yeah,
cards. Yeah, I've reached out to them a little bit, but it's another government department, and there's like with every country, there's a way of doing things. There's a
Mm,
certain style of bureaucracy, and we have our way here. So it's going to
yeah,
be a while before they find their feet, before they get up to speed. It'll be a lot longer before there's any immediate ramifications with regards to the operators. And like I said, from my understanding of regulations, most of the operators are already way above the line.
So, what do you think the biggest misconception in terms of public perception is about the incoming regulator then?
There's a line I used which I heard I overheard someone say it in a pub where they're talking about it, and it was the first member of the public I'd ever heard mention a regulator. So that was, once I heard him, picked up, I was like, "Ooh, what are you guys talking about?"
Yeah.
And it was, the regulators is going to bring these gambling companies to heel. Now they're talking about one gambling company in particular. We all know who it is, and they're saying, "Oh, they're going to bring them to task, and they'll bring them in order. They're making too much profits, and this is definitely going to put the power back in the customer's hands." That's not what regulators do, folks. That's not what they are. Their job is to oversee companies. That's not actually the same thing as protecting the customers.
Yeah.
They're separate streams. Yes, there's a little bit of crossover, but making sure the companies behave in an ethical way isn't actually directly influencing making sure the customers are safe or the customers are adhered to. So I think there's that misunderstanding. Like, the regulators aren't going to get you your losses back. That's unfortunately very unlikely. The regulators aren't going to ensure that you get the best ACA odds, or that the dispute you had and whether or not that was a penalty goal, or whether or not that horse finished, whether or not you should have been paid out. That's not their job. It's unlikely they're going to get into small individual disputes. Duncan, that's much more the air they are. They're probably looking at a much larger scale to make sure that funds are segregated, to make sure that people adhere to the proposed advertisement watershed, to make sure that terror financing isn't being engaged, or there's no spurious transaction behavior. The safer gambling aspect will be serious, and I know the regulator here and the regulator in the UK, they're putting that as a flagship issue. But again, making sure that limits work isn't necessarily the same thing as making sure players are well protected. So I think that's one of the great misconceptions of what they can and can't actually do.
I find it really interesting, and I think it's one of the great failings of the ADR system in the UK has been that ADRs were prohibited from reviewing responsible gambling claims, and these were forwarded on to the regulator. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not criticising the regulator's management of these cases, but the regulator just reviews the cases for overall patterns. Which means individual cases aren't getting reviewed. The only time that individual cases really seem to get reviewed is when they are for very, very high values. And this creates a two-tier system for the most the most vulnerable consumers, where unless you are losing high 5-6 figures, your claim isn't going to actually be reviewed. And you're the ones who can least afford to take it through the court system. But I think a lot of public perception is that that's what the regulator's there to do, to review individual cases, and it just isn't the reality.
Even just think of the mechanics and logistics of review of individual cases. There's one company, there's one outfit that already do that. The operators. They're the only people who can already do that. And they've given you an answer you don't like. The knowledge, the understanding of not just one operator, but how the entire sector and how every single company offering their services will work. That's what you would need for regulators to individual cases. Plus, you need a staggering workforce. I'm talking like 5 figures.
I think if I'm quite brutal about it, I think that's part of what needs to happen. I know it's perhaps a little unrealistic, but the truth is that's my hope for the ombudsman system coming in the UK, is that they're going to take on the responsible gambling claims. I hope that the system is smart enough not to require the ADR system, because ombudsmen traditionally take far, far longer to review claims.
Oh yeah.
Would it be?
And what we want is the short, easier cases being reviewed by ADR, and the complex and perhaps gambling harm-related cases being escalated to the ombudsman for a higher level review.
Would it be easier, I don't know, to outsource, like different ADRs, just, okay, we got this, and then we sort of, have a ticketing system and...
Who would you get though? Because I'm not aware that there's, even if you want to do the RG cases, there's not that many people out there that would be specialized enough and experienced enough to actually do those cases.
That is a
like they're few and far between.
We're going to need a cloning machine.
Well, I think me and you, Pedro, will be covered, and you as well, Duncan. But I don't think there's going to be too many others.
Well, but
not
I
being
think
smart at, but I think that is the problem.
I think it's important. I worked once for a company, and I wanted to spend just 4 hours, taking my stuff from the phones and the chats and training them on a certain aspect. I got told, oh, we don't want them to be psychologists, and I said, look, it takes more than 4 hours to become a psychologist. But you find this sort of stuff, sometimes.
I think, and I can very much associate with this, I think that there is a real, I want to say lack of respect, but lack of understanding of the skill set that's actually involved in managing cases of this nature properly.
Oh yeah,
a lot of people think it's just glorified customer service, and that is a misconception that needs to change.
If this job was just CS, I wouldn't have lasted as long as I did. There's no way. You can't have those engagements and those interventions with players and still adhere to the very stringent rules of customer service. It's a different role. You have customer service agents for a reason. You have fraud agents for a reason. You have security, game integrity. They all do a different job. RG and safer gambling is a completely separate animal. You don't have to be a psychologist, but you do need to have a better understanding of human behavior other than, sorry, sir, we cannot meet that requirement. Or please try again next week. And like I said, it's not to be disparaging, it's not to be dismissive towards CS, but it's not a CS job. It's not a job you can hire a machine to do either. Like if you're really engaging customers, you have to be prepared to absorb a lot of very personal, very harrowing material. Same as not being a counselor, but there's not a whole lot of difference between them. You do need to understand people and be willing to take on stuff that the average person just wouldn't.
I mean, I always said you don't need to be the counselor, but you need some counseling skills, So
yes.
Yeah. Right. Okay. I think we're bracing on an hour and a quarter here, so we have taken more than enough of your time this evening, Ciaran. So why don't we wrap this up? Well, I had noticed that as we went through, you fell into shadow. I think it would be great to have another chat to you in a few months' time once we start to get a better idea of how the Irish regulatory map is shaping up. I think that would be really, really interesting. But let's call it a day for just now, and we can look at setting that up later.
Thank you, guys.
Bye for now.
Bye for now.
Don't hang up.
I'm not going to, but what I'm going to do is run around the house and put on the lights. So I'll leave my camera on, but I'll just be back.